In the 1930s, organized crime in America operated like a shadow government. Al Capone ran Chicago with an iron grip, his name alone enough to silence a room. Lucky Luciano built an empire in New York so vast that even politicians answered his calls. Meyer Lansky handled the money, and the commission, that loose council of Italian and Jewish mob bosses, carved up the country like a business deal, dividing territories, settling disputes, and printing fortunes from every vice imaginable. They ruled America. That much is not disputed by anyone who has studied the period. But Harlem belonged to one man. And he wasn't Italian. He wasn't part of any commission. He didn't inherit power or marry into it. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The streets called him Bumpy. And for the better part of 3 decades, nothing moved through Harlem. Not a dollar, not a deck of cards, not a policy slip. Without his knowledge or his permission, to understand what that means, you have to understand what Harlem was. It wasn't just a neighborhood. By the 1930s and 1940s, Harlem was the cultural capital of Black America. It was where Langston Hughes wrote poetry and Duke Ellington played sets that changed the direction of music. It was where churches held thousands on Sunday mornings and where barbershops doubled as newsrooms for information that white papers would never print. But it was also a place that existed in many ways outside the law's protection. Police precincts in Harlem were not there to serve the community. They were there to contain it. And the official economy, the banks, the unions, the construction firms, the manufacturing jobs had largely shut Black Americans out. So Harlem built its own economy, an underground one. And at the center of that economy, eventually, stood Bumpy Johnson. Before we talk about how he rose, we need to talk about why someone like him could rise at all. Because the story of Bumpy Johnson is not simply a crime story. It is, at its foundation, a story about exclusion. In the early 20th century, Black Americans in northern cities faced a particular kind of trap. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of people from the South into places like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, searching for something better. What they found was different from the Jim Crow South, but not necessarily fairer. Housing covenants kept them locked into specific neighborhoods. Hiring discrimination kept them out of most industries. The banking system refused them loans. Even organized crime, which was itself a product of immigrant exclusion, Italians and Jews building illegal empires because legal ones wouldn't have them, even that world had a color line. Black racketeers were not invited to sit at the table. They were expected to pay tribute to it. Harlem's numbers racket, which generated enormous sums of money every single week, was seen by the white mob as territory to be taken, not as a community institution to be respected. This is the world Bumpy Johnson entered, and it is the world he refused to accept on anyone else's terms. Johnson was born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina. His family moved north when he was a child, eventually settling in Harlem. The bump on the back of his head gave him his nickname, and it stuck for life. He was, by most accounts, an unusually intelligent young man, well-read, articulate, and possessed of a kind of quiet confidence that made people twice his age take him seriously. He read philosophy. He read literature. He could quote passages from memory and hold his own in conversation with lawyers and professors. But he also grew up on the streets of Harlem during a time when the streets were the only real career path available to a young black man with ambition and no connections to the white power structure. He learned the game early. He ran errands for local numbers operators. He watched how money flowed through the neighborhood. He studied who had power, and more importantly, how they kept it. And he understood, perhaps earlier than most, that violence alone wouldn't sustain anything. What sustained power was a combination of fear, loyalty, and the perception that you were necessary. His real ascent began through his partnership with Stephanie St. Clair, a woman who deserves far more historical attention than she has received. St. Clair, known as Queenie or Madame St. Clair, was one of Harlem's most formidable independent operators. She ran a numbers empire that made her wealthy and influential, and she did it in open defiance of both the white mob and the corrupt police who served as its enforcement arm. She was fiery, public, and unafraid. She once took out newspaper ads to expose corrupt cops by name, but she also understood that her operation needed protection, the kind that required someone who could move through darker spaces. Bumpy Johnson became that person. Their partnership was strategic, not sentimental. St. Clair had the infrastructure, the runners, the bankers, the network of bettors who played their numbers daily. Johnson had the muscle, the street intelligence, and the growing reputation that made rivals hesitate before moving against her operation. Together, they built something that no outside force had been able to build in Harlem, an organized, black-controlled economic operation that answered to no one outside the neighborhood. The numbers game itself is worth pausing on because it's often misunderstood or dismissed as petty gambling. It was not. In Harlem during this era, the numbers racket functioned as an informal economy that employed hundreds of people, runners who collected bets, bankers who managed the money, and controllers who oversaw the entire operation. It generated millions of dollars annually. It was, in practical terms, the largest employer in the neighborhood. People who couldn't get jobs in white-owned businesses could find work in the numbers. Shop owners who couldn't get bank loans could get quiet financing from numbers bankers. The money circulated within the community in ways that the formal economy simply did not allow. This is not to romanticize it. Gambling operations exploit people, they always have. But in the context of 1930s Harlem, the numbers racket was one of the only economic systems that black residents controlled from top to bottom, and Bumpy Johnson understood its value not just as a source of income, but as a source of power. Then, Dutch Schultz arrived. Arthur Fliegenheimer, his real name, though no one used it, was one of the most aggressive and violent gangsters in New York during the Prohibition era. As Prohibition wound down and liquor profits dried up, Schultz turned his attention to other revenue streams, and Harlem's numbers racket looked like easy money. He moved into the neighborhood with a simple proposition: hand over control or face consequences. Many black operators folded. Some were beaten. A few disappeared. Schultz had the weight of the white mob behind him, and he had no qualms about using extreme violence against people he considered beneath him. He installed his own people in key positions, took over collection routes, and began siphoning profits out of Harlem and into his own accounts downtown. It was, in every meaningful sense, a colonial operation. Wealth was being extracted from a community and sent elsewhere, and the people who had built the system had no say in how it was run. Bumpy Johnson did not fold. He fought, not in some grand cinematic way, but in the grinding, dangerous, block-by-block manner that actual street wars are conducted. There were beatings. There were retaliations. Schultz's collectors were targeted. His runners were threatened. Johnson organized resistance among black operators who had been too afraid or too scattered to push back on their own, and he gave that resistance a center of gravity: himself. This was not a war between equals in terms of resources. Schultz had more men, more money, and more connections to the broader criminal infrastructure of New York. But Johnson had something Schultz did not: the neighborhood. Harlem residents did not cooperate with Schultz's people. They did not inform on Johnson. They did not help the outsiders navigate their own streets. And over time, this mattered more than guns or money, because you cannot run a numbers operation in a community that refuses to participate in your version of it. The war escalated, and the pressure it created rippled outward. Schultz was already in trouble. Tax evasion charges, conflicts with other mob figures, a growing reputation for instability that made even his allies nervous. His obsession with controlling Harlem's numbers was draining resources and attracting attention that the broader underworld did not want. And then, in October of 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot in a Newark chop house. The hit was sanctioned by the Commission, by Luciano and the other bosses, and while it was motivated by many factors, Schultz had been pushing to assassinate a federal prosecutor Among other reckless moves, his removal opened the door. The man who walked through it was Bumpy Johnson. What happened next is, in many ways, the most important chapter of his story, and the one most often overlooked. A lesser figure would have simply filled the vacuum Schultz left and continued the war against whatever remnants tried to reclaim the territory. Johnson did something far more sophisticated. He negotiated. He sat down, directly or through intermediaries, with Lucky Luciano's people and brokered an arrangement. Harlem's numbers operation would continue to interact with the Italian mob's broader network, because in practical terms, it had to. The distribution chains, the protection arrangements, the political connections, these all ran through structures the Italian mob controlled. But the day-to-day operation in Harlem would remain in black hands. Johnson's hands. He would be the point of contact, the man who ensured the money flowed smoothly, and in return he would have autonomy within his territory. This was not equality. He was not made a member of the commission. He was not treated as a peer in the full sense, but he extracted something that no black criminal figure in New York had ever extracted before: recognition, a seat, even if it was at the edge of the table. And within Harlem, his authority was now effectively ratified by the most powerful criminal organization in the country. No one, from the outside at least, would move against him without consequences. This is where most accounts of Bumpy Johnson become simplistic, either turning him into a hero or a villain. The reality was more complicated, and that complication is the point. Johnson was, without question, a man capable of serious violence. People who crossed him suffered for it. He maintained his position through intimidation, and the threat behind his calm demeanor was never abstract. It was understood by everyone who dealt with him. He was a criminal. He profited from gambling, from extortion, from activities that harmed real people. None of that should be softened or excused. But he was also, simultaneously, a figure who used his position to protect Harlem in ways that no legitimate institution was willing to. He mediated disputes. He helped families who were behind on rent. He kept certain kinds of crime, particularly crimes against residents, lower than they might otherwise have been, because his authority depended on the community's tolerance, and he understood that tolerance had limits. Shop owners on 125th Street felt safer knowing he was present. Mothers who disapproved of everything he stood for still nodded to him on the street, because they knew that his presence meant a certain order would be maintained. He walked through Harlem in tailored suits, carried himself with a dignity that felt almost deliberate, as if he were making a point not just to the neighborhood, but to a country that treated black men as invisible. He gave to churches. He attended community events. He was a regular presence at cultural gatherings, and his appreciation for art and literature was not performed. People who knew him privately confirmed that he was genuinely well-read, genuinely thoughtful, and genuinely conflicted about the life he led. That conflict never resolved itself neatly. It simply existed, the way contradictions often do in real people living under impossible circumstances. Was he protecting Harlem or exploiting it? The honest answer is both, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a story that's cleaner than the truth. For years, this arrangement held. Johnson's authority in Harlem was stable, his relationships with the Italian mob functional if never warm, and his reputation in the neighborhood secure. But the world around him was shifting, and the shifts eventually reached even him. Federal law enforcement, which had largely ignored black organized crime in favor of pursuing Italian and Jewish mob figures, began to turn its attention more broadly. The Bureau of Narcotics, under Harry Anslinger, was particularly aggressive, and narcotics, heroin specifically, had begun flowing into Harlem in quantities that were transforming the neighborhood in devastating ways. Johnson's precise involvement in the heroin trade remains a matter of historical debate. Some accounts place him at the center of distribution networks. Others suggest he resisted the drug trade, understanding that heroin would destroy the very community that sustained his power. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. A man who may have profited indirectly from a trade he could not fully control and may not have fully endorsed. But what is not in dispute is that the federal government came for him. He was arrested on drug charges. The case against him was built over months, carefully, methodically, in the way federal cases always are. And the conviction, when it came, carried with it a sentence that would send him to the most infamous prison in America, Alcatraz. The Rock, the place where the government sent the people it most wanted to forget. Al Capone had been there. George Machine Gun Kelly had been there. And now Bumpy Johnson joined them, locked away on an island in San Francisco Bay, as far from Harlem as the federal government could physically place him. Alcatraz was designed to break people. The isolation, the cold, the dehumanizing routine. It was a system built to strip a person of everything that had defined them. For Johnson, who had built his entire identity on presence, on being seen, on walking through Harlem and having his authority acknowledged in every interaction, the removal was total. He was no longer Bumpy Johnson of 125th Street. He was inmate number, federal property, a man in a cell. The years he spent there are among the least documented of his life, in part because Alcatraz generated so little information about its inmates by design. But people who corresponded with him during this period described a man who read voraciously, who wrote letters that were thoughtful and measured, and who never stopped thinking about Harlem. And Harlem, in its own way, never stopped thinking about him. His absences of powerful figures always do. Others moved into the spaces he had occupied. Alliances shifted. The neighborhood changed. Heroin was gutting entire blocks. The post-war economy was pulling resources out of black communities. And the political landscape was beginning the slow transformation that would eventually produce the civil rights movement. But Johnson's name did not fade. It lingered in barbershops and on street corners, invoked not as a ghost, but as a standard. People measured the men who came after him against the man who had come before, and the men who came after were generally found wanting. When he was finally released after years behind bars, Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem. And here the story takes on an almost mythic quality, though the facts themselves are real enough. He walked through the neighborhood, and people came to him. Not in the way crowds gather for a celebrity, but in the way a community acknowledges the return of someone who matters. Handshakes, quiet words, nods of recognition. He was older. The world had changed. The Italian mob's grip on New York was loosening. New players were emerging. The drug trade was reshaping the economics of the street in ways that made the old numbers racket seem almost quaint. But Bumpy Johnson still carried something that could not be manufactured or stolen, the weight of his own history. He resumed his position, though in a diminished form. The absolute authority he had once held was no longer possible in a Harlem that had fractured and changed. But his influence persisted. His counsel was sought. His presence still meant something. He died on July 7th, 1968, of congestive heart failure at a restaurant on 125th Street. He was 62 years old. The funeral drew hundreds. People came from every corner of Harlem and beyond. Figures from the criminal world, yes, but also community leaders, business owners, musicians, writers. It was a gathering that reflected the full, contradictory scope of who he had been. In the years after his death, the mythology grew, as mythology always does when the person at its center is no longer alive to correct it. And this is where we must be careful, because some of the most widely circulated stories about Bumpy Johnson are not true. Frank Lucas, the drug dealer who became famous through his own self-promotion and later through the film American Gangster, claimed to have been Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man, his protege, his chosen successor. Lucas told this story repeatedly and in great detail, and it became the version many people accepted. But those who actually knew Bumpy Johnson during his final years have largely disputed this. Lucas was a figure in Harlem, but his proximity to Johnson appears to have been significantly exaggerated. He was not the heir to Johnson's empire. There was no empire to inherit in the way Lucas described. The relationship, to the extent it existed at all, was far more peripheral than the legend suggests. Lucas built his own operation, a heroin distribution network that caused immense harm to the very community Johnson had spent his life navigating, and he attached Johnson's name to it for credibility. It is important to separate the man from the myth that others constructed around him, because the real story is complicated enough without fictional embellishments. The real Bumpy Johnson was not a folk hero in any simple sense. He was a man who operated outside the law in a society that had placed the law outside his reach. He built power in a community that had been denied every legitimate avenue to it. He used violence, and that violence had real victims. He also used intelligence, negotiation, and an understanding of human nature that most people in positions of formal authority could not match. He was feared, and he was respected. And those two things existed simultaneously, not because he was extraordinary in some superhuman way, but because the world he lived in demanded exactly that combination from anyone who intended to survive it on their own terms. There is a temptation when telling stories like this to arrive at a clean conclusion, to say he was a product of his environment and leave it at that, as if that explains anything. Or to say he was simply a criminal who deserved what he got, or to say he was a hero who fought the system. None of these are sufficient. The truth about Bumpy Johnson is that he occupied a space that most moral frameworks are not designed to accommodate. A man who did real harm and real good, who was shaped by injustice and perpetuated his own forms of it, who protected people and exploited them, sometimes in the same gesture. When he walked down 125th Street, shop owners straightened up. Children were told to behave. Women greeted him by name. And somewhere in the background, someone owed him money and someone else owed him a debt of a different kind. The kind you repay with loyalty because he once made a phone call that kept your family in their apartment, or because his name alone stopped someone from hurting you. That was the world he built. Imperfect, contradictory, real. So when we ask what Bumpy Johnson was, gangster, guardian, opportunist, leader, maybe the more honest question is one we don't get to answer. Maybe the question is simply this: in a country that offered a black man in Harlem almost nothing, what was he supposed to become? And if we're uncomfortable with what he built, shouldn't we be at least equally uncomfortable with the country that made it necessary? That question has no easy answer, and perhaps that's exactly the point.